Now, a really special guy is going to speak to us today, this Friday morning. I'm so glad to be introducing you to Owen Hylton. Some of you will have met him before. If you're new to Owen, he is the pastor of a church in Brixton called the Beacon Church. He's a good friend of mine, and he is going to bring our devotional message today. Look forward to hearing what he has to say. I hope it blesses you.
Morning, Emmanuel Church, Brighton. My name is Owen Hylton, and I'm the pastor of Beacon Church in Brixton, which, in terms of where you are, is simply up the M23, the A23, and I literally live off the A23, and my church is off the A23, a little bit further north than where I am. It's great to be with you today. I've been invited to do a devotional with you, and that feels like a real privilege and a real honour. And I've been given the passage in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 2. It's one of those, I suppose, well-known, I think relatively well-known stories. It's a transition point in the life of Israel, the people of God, and I just think there are things that we can take from it, that we can learn from it. Just to really summarize the story, it's the point in the story where Saul has been killed on Mount Gilboa. He and Jonathan both fell on the same mountain in the same battle. And David is somewhere else, and he receives the news from somebody who was there at the battle, who managed to get out, who took with him Saul's crown and the band that was on his arm, who covered his head in ashes, and he headed to David to tell him what's happened. And he's an Amalekite, the Bible tells us. So he comes and reports to David what's happened. He reports that Saul has been killed, and alongside his son Jonathan. And it's quite a moment. David and his men are distraught. They mourn the death of Saul. David writes a funeral song for him. It's quite apt today. People writing maybe not songs for funerals, but definitely tributes, and so it's quite a moment in their history, and it's interesting to see how David responds, because there's part of it that's quite shocking, I suppose, and then I think there are some things that we can learn from it. The bit that is shocking is the person who comes to tell David the news, who admits himself that he was the one who ultimately killed Saul at Saul's request because Saul was dying. David then has him killed because he asks him, why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed? That was quite a big thing, and it's quite an interesting approach, something that maybe we would have struggled with, that kind of response from David. So it's a real moment in the life of the people of Israel, because they are moving from the king who God had rejected to the king who God had accepted. And in this particular passage, among all these other things that happens, David is anointed king a second time. He was previously anointed king by Samuel a number of years ago. He is anointed king a second time in this particular passage. And he hasn't become king yet. Abner, Saul's commander of the army, is still about. He is trying to anoint Saul's son, another son of Saul, as king. In the end, that doesn't come to anything, but that's what's going on here. So it's a moment of real transition. It's a moment, I suppose, where it's interesting. What do you do in such a moment of change and transition in a nation? such as this, where the king has been killed. And obviously in those days, the king meant so much more maybe than what we would think about today. So I just think there's a couple of things that we could just draw from it, a couple of lessons that we could learn from it as I've been thinking about it. The first is just this idea of the Amalekite who is killed, even though he brings David the news, he brings David the crown. This idea of, were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed? That's what David says to him. And clearly he wasn't. And whatever we might think about, well, he did some good stuff. He tried to do the right thing. That idea of taking the life of the Lord's anointed, for David, that wasn't, you don't do that. And although we don't have King Sauls these days, we definitely do have around us and among us people who God has anointed. And there is something about how do we handle that? How do we treat those who God has placed over us, who God has anointed to lead us? Do we treat them with the level of honour and respect that they deserve as God's anointed? I think there is definitely something in that for us to just think about. Secondly, I think this whole idea of David wrote a funeral song for Saul. You understand the relationship between David and Saul. It wasn't a great relationship. Saul in these last years was terrible in his way with David. He was trying to kill him. He was distracted from protecting the nation of Israel because he was so caught up and obsessed with trying to get rid of David. And you have to wonder about that. Yet when David writes this funeral song, he is gracious and honouring and kind towards Saul. It's really quite amazing. There's one line in it where he says, Saul and Jonathan in life, they were loved and gracious. They were loved and gracious. And yet you'd have to wonder, was Saul ever really gracious to David? But David's response to him in death was one of honour and graciousness. But what it made me think was some of us will be experiencing death around us. And we might be experiencing death of people that we loved and who were kind and gracious to us. But we may also be experiencing death of people who on earth we didn't like. There were things about them that we just thought, oh, that's not a great quality in you, or whatever it might be. But this story tells us that in death, you honour people. You honour people. And so our mind should always be to honour people, to pay honour in tribute to people where that opportunity comes for us. Even if it's someone maybe that we ourselves didn't like or but we knew. I think there is something about honouring people that this passage tells us. I think the other thing that we get in this passage at the beginning of chapter 2, David recognises things have changed. He's coming out of, if you like, hiding. He's been on the run for a while. And in a moment of great opportunity, he seeks the guidance of God. So there's a moment where David is thinking to himself, okay, what do I do now? And he comes to God. He says, what should I do now? And it's God who tells him, go to Hebron. And so he moves to Hebron in Israel, where he sets up, and immediately the people of Hebron and others anoint him the king of Judah. Later he would become the king of the whole of Israel, but at this moment he's anointed the king of Judah. So a moment of great opportunity and change and transition, that's the moment to seek God, to seek his guidance, to seek his counsel. And also for David, it was a moment to remain patient, because although things had changed, they hadn't changed sufficiently. He was not yet king, and he needed to become king, and God was going to do that. And so I think there are lessons there for us, which I hope I've just brought out a couple. I hope they are helpful for you. I hope that you are blessed this day, and that God continues to speak to you and guide you in your life. So God bless you, Emmanuel. Great to be with you. Have a great day.